Chapter 7. The tracks led to the east. At least, that was the general direction that Will had discerned from them. As the unknown horseman had made his way down the mountain, the track wound and twisted on itself, of necessity, as he followed the narrow, circuitous trails through the thick pine. But always, whenever there was choice, or a fork in the trail, the horseman chose the one that would eventually take him eastward once more. Exhausted before the first hour was out, Will kept doggedly on, stumbling in the snow from time to time and, on occasions too numerous to count, falling full length to lie groaning. It would be so easy, he thought, to just stay here, to let the aches in his unfit muscles slowly ease, to let the pounding of the pulse in his temples calm down, and to just rest. But each time the temptation seized him, he thought of Evelyn, how she had hauled him up the mountain, how she had helped him escape from the stockade where the yard slaves waited for their eventual death, how she had nursed him and cured him of the mind-numbing addiction to wormweed. And, as he thought of her and what she'd done for him, somehow, each time, he found a tiny, hidden reservoir of strength and purpose. And somehow, he dragged himself to his feet again and staggered on in pursuit of the tracks in the snow. He kept dragging one foot after another, his eyes cast down to the tracks. He saw nothing else, noticed nothing else, just the impressions of the hooves in the snow. The sun dropped behind the mountain, and the instant chill that accompanied its disappearance ate through his clothes, damp with the sweat of his exertions, and gnawed deep into his flesh. Dully, he reflected that he was lucky he had thought to bring the blankets with him. When he finally stopped for the night, the damp clothes would become a potential death trap. Without the warmth and dryness of the blankets to cocoon him, he could freeze to death in his damp clothes. The shadows deepened, and he knew nightfall wasn't far away. Still, he kept on, keeping going as long as he could distinguish the scuffed hoof marks in the trail. He was too exhausted to notice the variations in the tracks. The deep troughs dug by the horse's locked-up front legs as it had slid down the steepest sections of the path. Those areas were only remarkable to him for the fact that he fell down them himself more often than not. He could read none of the subtleties and secret messages that he had been trained to see. It was enough that there was a clear trail to follow. It was all he was capable of. It was long after dark, and he was beginning to lose sight of the tracks now. But he continued as long as there was no possible deviation, no fork in the trail where he might have to choose one direction over another. When he came to a place where he must choose, he told himself, he would stop and camp for the night. He would wrap himself in the blankets. He might even risk a small, well-shielded fire where he could dry his clothes. A fire would bring warmth and comfort and light. And smoke. Smoke? He could smell it, even as he thought of a fire. Pine smoke, the all-pervading smell of life in Scandia, the scented fragrance of the burning pine gum as it oozed from the wood and crackled in the flames. He stopped, swaying on his feet. He had thought of fire and, instantly, he could smell smoke. His tired mind tried to correlate the two facts, then realized there was no correlation, only coincidence. He could smell smoke because, somewhere near at hand, there was a fire burning. He tried to think. A fire meant a camp, and that almost certainly meant that he had caught up with Evelyn and whoever it was who had abducted her. They were somewhere close by, stopped for the night. Now all he had to do was find them, and what? He asked himself in a voice thickened by fatigue. He took a long swallow from the water skin that he'd hung from his belt. He shook his head to clear it. For hours now, his entire being had been focused on one task, to catch up with the unseen horseman. Now he had almost accomplished that. He realized he had no plan as to what to do next. One thing was certain, he wouldn't be able to rescue Evelyn by brute force. Swaying with fatigue, almost unconscious, he barely had the strength to challenge a sparrow. What would Holt do? He asked himself. It had become his mantra over the past months, whenever he found himself uncertain over a course of action. He would try to imagine his old mentor beside him, eyeing him quizzically, prompting him to solve the problem at hand by himself, to think it through, then to take action. The well-remembered voice seemed to sound in his ear. Look first, Holt had been fond of saying, then act. Will nodded, content that he had solved the problem for the time being. Look first, he repeated thickly, then rest, then act. He gave himself a few minutes' rest, hunkered down and leaning against the rough bole of a pine. Then he stood erect once more, his muscles groaning with stiffness. He continued on the track, moving now with extra caution. The smell of smoke grew stronger. Now it was mixed with something else, and he recognized the smell of meat roasting. A few minutes later, moving carefully, he could discern an orange glow up ahead. The firelight reflected from the whiteness of the snow all around him, bouncing and magnifying in intensity. He realized that it was still some way ahead and continued along the trail. When he judged he was within 50 meters of the source of light, he moved silently off into the trees, fighting his way through the thick snow that came knee-deep or higher. The trees began to thin out, revealing a small clearing and the camp set around the fire. He lowered himself to his belly and inched forward, staying concealed in the deep shadows under the pines. He could make out dome-shaped tents now, 3 of them, arranged in a semicircle around the fire. He could see no sign of movement. The smell of roasting meat must have hung in the still, clear air long after the meal had been eaten, he realized. He started to edge forward when a movement behind the tents stopped him. He froze, absolutely still, as a man stepped forward into the fringe of the firelight. Stocky, dressed in furs, his face was hidden in the shadow cast by the fur hat he wore. But he was armed. Will could see the curved sword hanging at his waist, and the slender lance that he held in his right hand, its butt planted in the snow. As he looked, he made out more detail. Horses, 6 of them, tethered among the trees to one side. He supposed that meant 6 men. He frowned, wondering how he could possibly get Evelyn away from here, then realized that, so far, he hadn't seen her. He cast his gaze around the camp, wondering if perhaps she was inside one of the tents. Then he saw her. Huddled under a tree, a blanket pulled up to her shoulders. Peering more closely, he made out the bonds that kept her fastened in place. His eyes ached, and he rubbed the back of one hand across them, then pinched the bridge of his nose between 2 fingers, trying to force his eyes to stay focused. It was a losing battle. He was exhausted. He began to wriggle back into the forest, looking for a place where he could hide and rest. They weren't going anywhere this evening, he realized, and he needed to rest and recover his strength before he could accomplish anything. Tired as he was, he couldn't even begin to formulate a coherent plan. He would rest, finding a spot far enough away to give him concealment, but not so far that he wouldn't hear the camp stirring in the morning. Ruefully, he realized that his earlier plans for a fire were now thwarted. Still, he had the blankets. That was something. He found a hollow under the spreading branches of a massive pine and crawled into it. He hoped that the horsemen wouldn't patrol round their camp in the morning and find his tracks, then realized there was nothing he could do to prevent it. He untied the rolled-up blankets and hauled them tight around him, leaning against the bole of the massive tree. He was never sure that he didn't fall asleep before his eyes actually closed. If not, it was certainly a close-run thing. Evelyn had sensed the antagonism between the two warriors the night before. In the morning, it reached crisis point. She wasn't to know it, but this was just the latest in a series of arguments between the two men. The small scouting party was one of many that had crossed the border into Scandia. Some weeks previously, Evelyn had actually seen a member of an earlier party near the hut where she and Will had spent the winter. The man who had captured her, Chiren, was the son of a high-ranking Temujai family. It was the Temujai custom to have their young nobles serve a year as common soldiers before they were promoted to the officer class. Atalan, the commander of the scouting party, was a long-term soldier, a sergeant with years of experience. But, as a commoner, he knew he would never rise above his present rank. It galled him that the arrogant, headstrong Chiren would soon outrank him, just as it galled Chiren to take orders from a man he considered to be his social inferior. The day before, he had ridden off into the mountains on his own to spite the sergeant. He had taken Evelyn prisoner on a whim, without any real thought of the consequences. It would have been better had he remained unseen and allowed her to go on her way. The scouting party was under strict orders to avoid discovery, and they had no orders to take prisoners. Nor was there any provision for the holding or guarding of them. The simplest solution, Atalan had decided, was that the girl must be killed. As long as she was alive, there was the chance that she would escape and spread the word of their presence. If that happened, Atalan knew he would pay with his own life. He felt no sympathy for the girl, nor did he feel any antagonism. His feelings about her were neutral. She was not of the people and so barely qualified as a human being. Now he ordered Chiren to kill her. Chiren refused, not out of any regard for Evelyn, but simply to infuriate the sergeant. Evelyn watched anxiously as they argued. Like the previous night, it was obvious from the way they kept pointing to her that she was the reason for their disagreement. It was equally obvious, as their argument became more and more heated, that her position was becoming increasingly precarious. Finally, the older of the two drew back his hand and slapped the younger man across the face, sending him staggering a few paces. Then he turned and strode towards Evelyn, drawing his curved sabre as he came. She looked from the sword in his hand to the totally matter-of-fact expression on his face. There was no malice, no anger, no expression of hatred there. Just the determined gaze of someone who, without the slightest qualm or hesitation, was about to end her life. Evelyn opened her mouth to scream, but the horror of the moment froze the sound in her throat, and she crouched, open-mouthed, as death approached her. It was odd, she thought, that they had dragged her here, left her overnight, and then decided to kill her. It seemed such a pointless way to die.